I'm Stefanie Sanford. I am the Director of U.S. Program Policy and Advocacy for the Gates Foundation. The foundation is founded on a pretty simple principle that everyone, everywhere deserves the opportunity to live a healthy and productive life. In the developing world, that means we focus on health and agriculture to fight disease and to eradicate extreme poverty. And in the U.S., that means that we focus on education, not because poverty doesn't matter, but because education, we believe, is the building block to opportunity in the United States. And within education, we've known for a long time that the critical component, the most important in-school factor, is an effective teacher. And we've known that for a long time. We've known that there are great differences between good teachers and not so good teachers. What we haven't known is what great ones do and how we emulate the great ones, how we take okay ones and how we make them better. And that is the purpose of our panel today. How is it that we develop and retain and create great teachers? So before I introduce our panel, I'm just going to take just a minute to give a quick update. The foundation has really focused in the last 4 years on effective teaching, particularly the Measures of Effective Teaching project. And that is, give you just a sense of the size and scale of that, and to tease a little bit for you that our final report will be coming out in the second week of January. And this is something, because we were struck, our co-chairs were struck that given that we have known so long of how important teaching is, we were struck at really how little we knew about what to do about it. So that's what MET is about, to really look at multiple measures: student growth over time, classroom observations, student surveys, working conditions, and the ability to really diagnose, to really lead to quality feedback. It's a big project. Just of its scale, there are 3,000 teachers involved, 2,250 observation scores, 900 trained observers, and 44,500 student surveys. So it's a big piece of research that we do hope really, really can inform the field. Just to give you a little sense, as we've begun to answer that question about what is it that, that highly effective teachers do, here's just a quick list. This is what the research has begun to teach us. One, they use a variety of strategies to engage students, really rich dialogue. We've actually done some school visits, and when you see it, it's really palpable how sort of different the student interaction is with a highly effective teacher. They create opportunities for students to get feedback on their thinking. We hear a lot about critical thinking skills, and that's something is sort of vague. We're really honing in on what that looks like. Help students ask meaningful, higher-order questions. Coach students to be able to conduct and extend discussion about the task, and then expose students to rich content. This was the thing that really surprised us. One of the things we looked at was student surveys. And this is not like the ones that we did in graduate school or even in undergraduate, where it was payback time for a teacher you didn't like. These are student instruments. And what we found is actually, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, which is that students are the ones who spend the most time with the teachers over time. And we actually found that these student surveys are, that one, students take them seriously, and two, they really are kind of predictive about effective teaching. So our preliminary findings about this idea of multiple measures, which again is sort of a jargon that we hear a lot about, just to frame that up, that Tom Kane, who's the primary architect of this bit of research, says it best. He says it's like having superheroes, that if you're going to have a group of superheroes, you don't want them all to have the same superpower, so that each one of these multiple measures actually has a different superpower. And that's what we're really trying to say here, is that you have value-added scores, which is the measure of student learning, that's actually quite predictive of student learning. But its potential, a test score, and we hear this in the blowback about testing, that it doesn't give you great insights. How do you help teachers improve? The student surveys are actually really reliable. When students do them, the way that students rate their teachers actually is amazingly consistent and reliable. And then on the observation, not as predictive of student learning. You had a lot of variability in the way that these keys, so you need to do multiple observations. But the potential for diagnostic insight is big. So in other words, how do you give a teacher, if students aren't learning, and your system is about helping teachers improve, you need this diagnostic so you can get feedback and say, this is how you can be better. So that ultimately, this sort of system of teacher effectiveness and this project is to really say, how is it that you create a system that really helps teachers improve and thus helps improve student learning? That's really the logic of it. And that's really about our research, our contribution to this field. And we will be putting that out, available on the web. We'll be doing a number of briefings in the second and third week of January, and then to really dive into these methodologies and the full range of the findings. But to really shift, because research is good and it's interesting and it's actually something that's necessary, but our panelists today are out in the field making this happen today. I'm pleased to share the dais with my friends, the talent, as I like to call them. Tim Daly, the president of the New Teacher Project. Gary Holder-Winfield, a Connecticut state representative who chairs the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus and was a key architect of their new law. And Chris Cerf, the New Jersey Commissioner of Education. You have their bios in your packet. I want to have each of them take a few minutes and talk about their work, particularly in the teacher effectiveness arena. And then I have a couple of follow-up questions for them, and then we really do want to bring you all into this discussion. So I'd like to start. So Tim, the irreplaceables. You guys really do have a knack for coining a phrase of your reports and also getting a lot of traction with your reports as one of the architects of the widget effect. So tell us a little bit about the irreplaceables and what you found.
Thank you, Stefanie, first of all. Good to be with all of you this afternoon. Education is a human capital intensive business. It's like a lot of other industries where essentially the value is created by individuals who work on the front line, and that's almost all of where the value is. So in education, there are other things that add value, absolutely. But as Stefanie was referencing, we've known for a long time that it's the variation between teachers that is the defining fact, really, of American schooling. But the truth is that behind that variation is this myth of interchangeability. And that was something that we learned a lot about working with school districts and that we wrote about in 2009 in a report called The Widget Effect. So it's this dynamic that while teachers vary widely, there is a culture of ignoring that difference at the school level. And indeed, there's this active effort to pretend that one teacher is the same as another for lots of pretty good reasons. So for instance, the principal of a school has every incentive to tell parents that all of the second grade teachers are just fine. They're all good. Even the one it's their first day of school ever is totally an acceptable alternative to the 20-year star that the parent is requesting their child to be in their classroom. So the myth of interchangeability pervades a lot of things, and it creates a culture essentially of passivity when it comes to managing teachers. And that was what we looked at in this study that we published this summer called The Irreplaceables. Our question essentially was, if we have had such a focus for 40 years or more on creating concentrations of very good teachers in low-income areas, why does it never seem to work? So it's one of the biggest focal points of federal policy. It's something that we've spent billions of dollars on. It's something that almost every state claims is a central goal of its education funding system, of its teacher preparation system, and on and on and on. And it's also something that is just a universally held value, that all kids deserve good teachers, and the kids that face the greatest challenges deserve the even better teachers. And yet, every study confirms that the opposite is true, that wherever you have students with more challenges, there usually is a lower concentration of great teachers. And we didn't understand how that could be. How we could all have a shared goal that is well enshrined in policy, and yet there is really no state in the union that you could point to that's made a lot of progress on it. And beneath all that, we found that if you have a concept of interchangeability, that leads to a culture of passivity, and that means that essentially principals in schools and districts were entirely indifferent as to who stayed in the district over time. As long as someone was willing to endure the challenges that the district presented, they could stay. And that meant that some not very good folks chose to stay. It also meant that if you were a star, no one really did anything to let you know that or to prioritize you staying for the long term, so you often left. Maybe to go somewhere that was more affluent, that paid a little bit more money, or the school faced fewer challenges, or it was closer to your house. Could be any of those things. And we wanted to know why. What is it about this group of folks that we called irreplaceables that cause those patterns? And more importantly, could they change? Is it somehow like a law of physics that teachers will seek to move away from children of greater need and toward children of lesser need? And essentially the study was structured to look at them in some detail, thousands of them across different districts. And basically, our conclusion was this. These teachers are not only demonstrably better than other teachers, they're wildly better than other teachers. They get about 6 months more of learning per year than a low-performing teacher. And most of these folks want to teach where they are needed. When they leave school districts, which is fairly often, about 75% of the time, they would stay if the biggest issue that was driving them out was addressed. And there were 3 types of issues that came into play. One of them was the principals weren't working very hard to get them to stay. I won't bore you with all of the details, but here's one. Imagine these teachers who I just said get 6 months more of learning per school year than the average teacher. About 2/3 of them told us that no one in their school building, in the leadership, principal, assistant principal, department chair, had ever asked them to stay. So no one had done something just as simple as saying, we really need you. The second category of issues is working conditions. It really is true that on a lot of different dimensions, these are difficult places to teach. Parent engagement is a common complaint. Safety is a complaint. The cleanliness and level of repair of the school building is a complaint. And what that means is that all other things being equal, if you have a fairly equal principal and you're making an equal amount of money, but you face working conditions issues that make it more challenging for you, over time, people are going to leave those places and go to somewhere else. So we don't need to have, equal principals in these places or equal amounts of money. We actually need to create inequality in terms of advantages for teachers that work in those places if they are going to continue to face disadvantages that we have little control over. The location of a school building, for instance, is not something that's easy to change. We can't pick up all the buildings and move them to the suburbs where these folks live. So the second category of things is working conditions. And the third one is policies. The hard truth is that we found a number of ways in which being a great teacher simply doesn't count in policy. And that in many ways, great teachers are actively devalued. So for instance, more than half of these folks who are top teachers that we call irreplaceable make less money than the average low-performing teacher in their district. So we've had debates for a long time about merit pay and how you choose to compensate. Let's just be clear, we don't compensate equally now. We pay different amounts of money to different teachers for different reasons. And the way it all shakes out is that 55% of our star teachers make less money than the very worst teachers in their district because of the way that we choose to pay salary differentials. What that means is that for some of these irreplaceables who have 3 or 4 or 5 years of experience, and they told us this in focus groups over and over again, they cannot, by law, by contract, get a raise for staying where they are. They can get a raise for going anywhere else. So think about that. It takes 20 years to move up the ladder, and that is enshrined in a document. That is guaranteed. They know that they will not reach the top of the salary schedule for 23 years. But if they move to the suburbs, they can get a raise next week. And we think that somehow maybe they're not going to notice that. Or that out of the goodness of their hearts, they might stay there. And they won't. So the big thing that I think we need to grapple with as a group is that we have to have more than a wish and more than hope that great teachers are going to stay where we want them to be. This is a pattern that goes back decades. It is deeply woven into the fabric of how our schools run. Almost every single one of us knows amazing teachers who ask themselves over and over again, how long am I going to do this in a very difficult situation? And yet we've mostly sat on our hands in terms of making the changes that it would take to get retention rates of irreplaceables to be more than 95% per year.
Thanks, Tim. As always, provocative. We'll look forward to coming back to some of that. Gary, I wanted to ask you, actually, both you and Chris are both going to talk about policies that have recently been passed at the state level to try to get at some of the conditions and dynamics that Tim was talking about. Gary, you want to tell us about about the elements of the law as well as some of the story of what it took to get passed. I know part of the impetus was I believe the worst in the nation racial achievement gap in Connecticut, and that was a real impetus for that.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. Last year was dubbed the Session of Education in Connecticut. The governor put forward a monster bill that tried to deal with many aspects of what was wrong in Connecticut. In the last couple of years, Connecticut has come to know that while sometimes being the richest or second richest state in the nation, we have on two measures, the worst or fourth from the bottom worst achievement gap in the nation, depending on whether you're talking about race or economics. And so the issue of education has been part of the discussions we've been having for a long time. We haven't been doing much about it, but we've been discussing it. So last year, the governor puts forward this piece of legislation. He gives his beginning of the year speech, in which I think the governor mistakenly said some things that didn't help us with the discussion. He basically said that teachers in our state just sat around for 4 years and then got tenure, and that's how this discussion started. Well, I mean, this is not going to go well, regardless of whether you have unions or not. I mean, you just took a large group of people and told them they were lazy and don't do anything. And so I think that's important, though. It's important to remember, because a lot of the discussion we have about education reform, I think some of the things we fight about, we don't have to fight about. And we had a big fight about a lot of things. And actually, if you actually stepped back and paid attention to what was going on, there was a lot of agreement on both sides. But there was a need to fight because of the words that were spoken at the very beginning. And so a lot of the debate focused around teacher tenure. That was the core of the big debate. And I think actually even there, you had some agreement. In the final bill, you had when a teacher is going to be tenured or they're going to be let go, the way that we were doing it was we had a panel of three. One would be a representative basically of the union, another would be a representative of the superintendent, and the third would be somebody who they both agreed upon. Well, in the final bill, we just had the person who they agreed upon, right? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the other two anyway. But that was a big fight. And it was a big fight that we didn't have to have, because if you actually listened at the very beginning, the unions were saying, well, why don't we just have the person who is the person in the middle, right? They knew that we didn't need to have the other two people, but we fought about it. And when I look at policy and whether we're going to get policy done, I find it interesting that when I'm listening to Tim speak, I'm thinking to myself, what I'm not hearing in a lot of the discussion is exactly what Tim's saying. I'm hearing all about what we should do to teachers, but that's feedback that comes from teachers, right? It's not like they're not saying this. It's not like, even in a union environment, and many of us in my position, I'm not talking about other people in the education reform debate, many people in my position are out trying to do something, but they're not listening to what's coming from the people who become, and I'm not saying that we're necessarily vilifying those people, but they're not listening to those people who are supposed to be the villains in this, which are the teachers' union. And so I'll just run through a couple of the things that we did in the bill and then talk a little bit more about that. Our bill touched on a lot of things. The major discussions were about, again, teacher tenure, about K through 3 reading, which actually didn't get as much emphasis as it should have been. And it started off with the governor trying to write a bill where when we turned around schools, because that was another major focus of the bill, when we turned around schools, we could bypass some of the contractual obligations we had. That didn't wind up happening. So there was finally in the bill, there was originally 4 tiers for how you would judge a teacher. Whether they were proficient, effective, a whole host of these 4 things, but we couldn't quite come to an agreement. So we basically wound up saying teachers either effective or ineffective. And actually at the end of the time when we had a bill, we hadn't actually well defined those 2 terms. Those were still being worked on. But the teacher who was effective would be able to continue, and the teacher who was ineffective would be let go. We said to teachers that, and at least in the state of Connecticut, when you're being trained to teach, you have a requirement to be in the classroom for 1 semester. We changed that to where you have to be in the classroom for 4 semesters, giving you some more experience. I would have liked to have seen in those 4 semesters that teachers who are new have to have some time in an urban environment. Many of the new teachers get pushed into those environments and are completely unprepared. And I'm not sure that their inability to operate in that environment is really about them being a bad teacher as much as them being unprepared for that environment. I talked a little bit about K-3 reading. What we did there was we actually have a diagnostic test which is pretty ineffective in Connecticut. We ran a pilot program to look at a new diagnostic test that might be more effective. But where teachers are concerned was we decided that there should be PD associated with it so that those teachers would be trained on how to administer these tests. And actually, one of the concepts originally in the bill was that these teachers would have to take a practice reading test because teachers who, I don't know the year off the top of my head, but teachers who come out of schools now are required to take a test to evaluate whether they can teach reading, which kind of makes sense. But teachers who are already in the field don't have to do so. And so we felt as though we needed to negotiate making sure that we knew whether the teachers in the field actually understood the science of reading and did not want to have a fight where we said we had a test and if you failed the test you couldn't teach anymore, and we got into the whole normal fight we always had. So we agreed upon taking a practice test that yearly would go to the State Department of Education so we could at least evaluate where our teachers were. And in that PD program, the courses that you take actually count towards your professional development. It would be based on reading assessment data that we would have. It would differentiate between training and normal training and intensive training. We would identify mentor teachers so that we could have those teachers begin to locally do the work, because the thinking was that as much as we could locally, we should do that type of work. And the one thing that was important in the bill and in this notion of professional development was that the principals would actually be trained about how this works, so that it's not just the teachers, but the principals actually have an understanding of what's going on. It's hard for them to evaluate if they don't. And one other thing, in our bill, when we talk about teachers, we refer to principals as well. So when we're talking about evaluation of teachers, that includes principals, which was something that kind of got lost as we went along. And I think it's important because, as was said by Tim, many of the teachers feel like the principals aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And actually, I think that's probably a pretty accurate assessment of what's going on. And so we incorporated into our bill principals under the heading of teachers.
So, Chris, you also were part of a bill that got passed in New Jersey, and I was interested that Gary began by raising concerns about the comments of a colorful governor. I realize that might be something that you all could have in common as a
we have a little bit of common.
context. So tell us a little bit about your law and what it contains and what it took to get it done.
I'm happy to. Thank you, Stefanie, and thanks to all for being here on this late afternoon. I'm going to begin by framing my discussion about what we've done in New Jersey with what I think are three basic research truths and relevant in this field. And I do that because I literally have them on my desk, because I ask all of you who are in a position to influence policy from one vantage point or another to ask yourself whether the laws or the regulations in your district, state, or jurisdiction actually honor what I believe are actually undebatable propositions. The first, as Stefanie said, is that teachers are by far the most influential determinant of a child's educational outcome in school. Poverty is indeed trumping, but or at least of great significance, but the in-school variable that makes the greatest difference is the effectiveness of the teacher. And I don't allow my staff to say the quality of the teacher, it is the effectiveness of the teacher. And I think that word choice is important. The second is, and it was actually interesting to get a peek at the outcome of the Met studies that Stefanie put up, is that a teacher's record in generating student achievement is the most predictive variable in anticipating future learning outcomes for students. Much more so than their SAT scores, the pathway to the profession, or any other variable. It is their actual track record in getting achievement. And the third is like engineers, like lawyers, like doctors, like any other profession, there is a natural distribution of talent and effectiveness. It's a bell curve. And the difference between effective and ineffective is real, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I taught high school for 4 years. This is a craft. Now, I mention all of that because when we started at this a couple years ago in New Jersey, was clear to us, as it is clear, I think, in many, many jurisdictions across the country, that not only does our system not honor those basic truths, but there are elaborate, embedded institutional bulwarks that have been erected to defend against acting on those truths. And the law that we sought to get passed was really organized around actually trying to do something in the realm of policy that reflects the reality that this basic research suggests. So when you look at the world of evaluation and tenure reform, it's important to sort of understand the taxonomy. The evaluation is the business of reviewing anybody. In this case, we're going to talk about teachers, or in our case, by the way, everything I say about teachers is also true of principals, but reviewing teachers and giving them some kind of rating based on some judgment about what matters. The next part of the taxonomy is, what do you do with that? That rating is an input that has an output, which has to do with everything from this person needs more professional development or training to this person actually is not in the appropriate profession, a tenure decision, a personnel decision of some kind. So we attempted to treat those two as those two related concepts in pretty aggressive ways. So I'm going to start with the second. I'm just going to start with the tenure bill itself. So New Jersey has the distinction of having passed the nation's first tenure bill over 100 years ago. And here's basically how it works. It's been essentially unchanged since then. That is, you achieve tenure on the basis of the passage of time. That is, after 3 years and a day, you are tenured. And once you achieve the status of tenure, it is extremely difficult to lose your job. Now, there's a lot of invocation of concepts like due process and all like that, but which are legitimate concepts, but wildly overstated in terms of their actual constitutional relevance. But the reality is, over the last 10 years, we have, I don't know, about 130,000 teachers in New Jersey. 17 teachers have lost tenure on the basis of being ineffective. That is, ineffectively. So that is an infinitesimally small percentage. So whatever the system it was intended to be, it was not yielding basically tenure, in effect, regardless of what the book said, was lifetime job security. So here's as it emerged from the process. And by the way, this bill, for interesting reasons, was unanimously passed by both houses of the legislature, both Democrat, signed by a Republican governor, and incredibly endorsed by the union. This sort of patina of harmony actually masks what was a knife fight in a dark room, but that was the ultimate outcome. So essentially the way it works is that the tenure was extended from 3 years to 4 years. You cannot get tenure until after the completion of the fourth year. The first year doesn't count, meaning that is a mentorship year, which is now required by statute, and there's some content by that. You only then get tenure if for 2 of the last 3 years you are rated on a 4-point scale ranging from ineffective to partially effective to effective to highly effective in the top 2 ratings. That is, you're effective or highly effective. If you hit that bar, and by the way, effectively you're an at-will employee up to the point that you get tenure. Then once you get tenure, you can lose tenure if you are on the basis of 2 consecutive years rated either ineffective or partially effective. There's a little noise around the edges, but that's basically it. Now, what does it mean to lose tenure? It means the following, that the superintendent, on the basis of these 2 ratings, must give it to the school board, and the school board must file tenure charges, and the tenure charges must be referred to an arbitrator, and all of this process needs to take place within less than 6 months. We also made it very, very clear that the standard of review was such that and this is a little bit in the weeds, but it actually is the heart of the bill, is that the only thing an arbitrator could look at when it came to one of these cases is was it based on political nepotism, or was it based on some kind of inappropriate consideration like race discrimination, gender discrimination, or the like? Was it based on a mistake of fact? I'll tell you in a moment that we do include student learning. If, for example, someone had literally run the numbers wrong, you could argue that that was a basis for it, or if it was just patently arbitrary and capricious. But specifically, the one thing that an arbitrator could not revisit was the rating itself. Why in the world would we think a judge, an ALJ, or an arbitrator is going to know more than the superintendent or the principal or the chairman of the department about how effective a teacher is? So we sort of took that all out of bounds. So that was the tenure bill. Behind that, we are, like everyone else in the country, embarked on trying to rationalize the teacher evaluation system. It is incredibly hard work. Moving from PowerPoint to reality is as hard in this realm as in any. We have taken a very inclusive view. We've had hundreds and hundreds of meetings across the state. We've created state committees, local committees. We embarked with a pilot program that we basically gave away several $1 million to districts who were recruited to do this. And we said, here are the lanes you have to stay in, and this will be up and running and effective come a year from this coming September. One is 50% of your rating has to be based on learning outcomes, and 50% of your rating has to be based on observation. And our basic view is what we really care about are outputs, if you will. That is how much students are learning. Now, the noise around this is, well, you're saying your 50% is based on tests. Well, actually, that's not the case. There's a lot of room given. If you happen to be a 4th through 8th grade teacher where there is a high stakes test, then you have to use that to a material degree, say 30, 35%. But even in an art class, a performance class, a welding class, you can have student learning objectives. You can evaluate student work. You can have something that is evidence of student learning. The other 50% is based on an observational rubric, and there are many out there. Frankly, I think they're more alike than they are different. You know, Danielson is the one that always sort of rolls off the tongue, but there are many, and it's based on multiple observations, and then it all sort of rolls up into a score. There has been a lot of, it's a very challenging thing to implement effectively to solve challenges like inter-rater reliability, but we are actually now have the data systems in place. We're not using the value-added system that Stefanie referred to. We're doing something called SGP, Student Growth Percentile, which basically normalizes comparisons based on the particular characteristics of the student. So that's the basic content of the bill. There's a wonderful backstory behind how this all happened, which I'm sure could come up in questions.
Wonderful backstory that describes the patina of comedy that masked a knife fight in a dark room. So would you like to share with us the backstory about the patina of comedy that masked a knife fight in a dark room?
I see a camera in the back, and that makes me nervous. I have a very, forgive me for all of the elected officials, including Gary to my right, but I've worked for President Clinton. I worked for a Democratic president, a Republican mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, and a Republican governor. So whatever I'm about to say is no reference to my specific bosses, but I've been around politics a lot, and I will tell you that for the most part, I am deeply cynical about the political process, and that getting people to take courageous policy decisions on the basis of what's right, as opposed to what is politic, is a very rare profile in courage. It happens. It's very admirable when it happens. There are many legislators who are deeply committed to doing right, regardless of the consequences. But as a general rule, the way to change things in government is to get people to recalculate their political interests. And as cynical as that sounds, I will tell you that effectively what happened on the tenure bill is that, so I'm a Democrat working in the cabinet of a Republican governor. So I used to be a very small crowd called a Democrat for Educational Reform. There's now actually quite a constituency for that. So essentially, when the governor took office, he was utterly committed to education reform. I mean, from the heart, very personal, deep commitment. And if you follow the news a little bit, a very, shall we say, direct and concrete in his views. And he basically did what Ronald Reagan did to the Soviet Union. He said, "There's no ambiguity here. This is the evil empire. This is something that, there's no room for moral debate here. This is bad. They're hurting kids in terms of the policies and strategies that they're adopting." And, obviously that's an exaggeration. I don't believe that, by the way. I am much more balanced than that. I'm not sure he even believes in that extreme way. But it completely changed the public conversation. People started asking hard questions about what was right for kids and what do these policies do, and that started to sort of wear away the opposition. There was then a very significant philanthropist who, whether it was true or not, bluff or not, started to make noises about running primary candidates against people who were opposed to the bill. And I will tell you that my impression is that people said, we got to make this problem go away. And that led to, I would say, a very collegial conversation between me and the NJEA and the head of the Democratic Education Committee. And we compromised, and we arrived at an outcome that I think is actually, all of us would now agree was a good outcome.
So Gary, you want to speak to the notions of, from the elected official perspective and the dynamics that you navigated there in Connecticut?
Well, yeah, sure, I'll do that.
We're here to entertain. It's the end of the day.
Yeah, I guess so. I get the point, but I think sometimes you have to make sure that you've not only said that what's happening is bad and what we're presenting is good, but that people have bought into the fact that it's good. So, particularly in this discussion about education reform, I don't think that everybody that is not doing something is not doing it because of a political calculation. I think many of them actually believe that the solution is not the solution. And so they're not going to adopt the solution because they just don't believe in it. We just did a bill in our state that actually initially looked pretty much like the bill that you did, almost a carbon copy of what you did. But for many reasons, it turned out to be completely different. And I think one of the reasons it turned out to be completely different is because the Democratic majority just didn't believe in what the governor was trying to do, and he didn't do a good job of selling it to, I mean, he's a Democrat, right? But he didn't do a good job of selling it to those in his own party. Much of what he wanted to do, I think, I agreed with. Some of it I actually disagreed with. But when it came to the legislature fundamentally did not agree and was being inundated by people across the state, not just teachers, who heard the governor talk about teachers in a certain way, who felt as though this was nothing more than typical education reform to destroy public education. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that came together, the bad perfect storm, if you will, and made this bill untenable. And so when the legislature got it, the legislature stripped the bill completely, except for a couple of things that a few of us on the Education Committee refused to let get stripped out of the bill. And so it was basically a bill where every section that the governor had would be filled in at some point later on. And then we began the work of rebuilding the bill. But, politically, I think it's important, we can talk about all the policy we want. I think it's important to recognize that you are talking about issues where not everybody agrees, and you have to talk about the issue in a way where you can get people on board. And I think you have to talk about the issue. In many legislatures, including mine, and I will talk about mine because that's where I am, we bring policies and we don't talk to each other about the policy. And we get to the floor and we're shocked that somebody disagrees with us. Well, I mean, listen, I love my brother and my sister, but we can't agree on anything, and we love each other. So I don't understand how you could get to the floor with whatever the number of other legislators is and think that they're going to agree with you. The background work is what doesn't get done. And again, sometimes those who we see as the enemy can be the best to move a policy. And we just don't do a good job of that. I think if we really care about education reform and dealing with what needs to happen, we really have to have a different type of conversation than we've had. And that's the reason why this bill stayed alive, I think, is because there were a couple of people who really wanted the bill to happen, who really were willing and invested in going and talking to people they don't normally talk to. That's what saved this bill. Had those people not done that work, the governor could have wanted the bill all he wanted, but you would have gotten a version of the bill that I don't think came close to doing what this bill does. And I think that's what's important when you're talking about politics. So, yes, I agree. I'm a little cynical myself. I was an activist for many years, and I wasn't one of those people who was going into politics, so I'm not completely foreclosed to what you're talking about. But I do think that other aspect of having those conversations that may be difficult with people who you don't see as allies is important.
So Tim, you try to change the conversation. You're a little bit insulated from the sort of knife fights that our two panelists were talking about, but even the best policy of changing a conversation runs into these realities. So talk a little bit about sort of what advice do you give from your posture as a researcher and an advocate to be able to help these two guys who very much want to do the right thing.
It's a good question. These stories are fascinating too. We kind of bridge a certain part of this world, meaning that we interact a little bit with policymakers like Chris and Gary, and we interact a lot with school districts, and our kind of reach sometimes goes down to the school level. We spend a ton of time surveying teachers and principals and looking at data trends, but we're not in classrooms every day watching what's going on. So we're, in some respects, the middleman here. And the one thing I'll say about the way that practice and policy fit together that's always fascinated me is that when we go to a state capitol to have a conversation about a bill, or we go to a policy conference, or we kind of get everybody in the same room to say, let's talk, it is sometimes amazing what people will say and what passes for fact with almost no discussion or scrutiny of it. And I realize that if you're in a policymaker's shoes, how do you know, right? I mean, it sounds right. This is a person that knows a lot about education. They're a professor, or they're a reformer, or they're a union leader. But many of these things really aren't true if you scratch beneath the surface and ask questions. And the answers sometimes are better in a sense than they lead us more closely to solutions than what people say is the case. So you'll hear a lot of absolutes. Everyone hates this. This never works. No one thinks that this is a priority. That has been tried and failed. You'll get a lot of that kind of stuff. But what you don't get is a little bit more like, if we put up the right guardrails here and don't try to overprescribe things, we can probably make things better by going in this direction than staying where we are now. And I think that to Gary's point about the need for people to slow down and stop and talk about things and find out whether there's overlap, I think that's true. And that's one place where for education reformers, especially of my generation, we have not been very good at this in the past. I think that we have tended to go first to the moral authority, or the kind of like outcry of, this is very important, we have to do it now, we're going to save the children, don't ask too many questions, just go with it. And trust us, that sort of answer. And on the other side, it's, often we represent the educators, trust us. And it's going to work much better, I think, if everyone admits that these interests are here to stay, that there are people that want to see very dramatic changes to schools. They're going to be around for a while, and they're going to be in the conversation. For a long time, it was easy to lock the door and keep them out, but they're here. But it's also true that the people who have represented what are sometimes called institutional or status quo interests in education are not going to just go away. They're still here, they still have constituents, and they still have a place in the conversation. And I think probably, whereas the last 5 years there's been this significant arrival of the reform agenda on the policy landscape, the next 5 years is going to be about trying to find some kind of equilibrium where groups can begin to develop more of a dialogue about what the future is going to be, rather than kind of suspecting that one side can nudge the other off the cliff.
So I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists, and then I'm going to open it up for you all. So there is a microphone there, so if you want to be getting your questions ready. I have one sort of related to what you all have said. So one, sort of what passes for facts, two, people aren't listening, and sort of implicitly then the political polarization. How much does evidence matter? I mean, we've spent about $45 million on the MET project to actually inject sort of rigorous, dispassionate evidence into this debate. How much does it matter?
Well, I think it matters enormously. I mean, for all the cynicism I just expressed, I do think that in the end, most people want to do the right thing, and they're influenced by by facts. It is very hard to get from sort of heartfelt, cliches to reality. Because, most officials, all, including, I'm sure everyone up here, are a mile wide and an inch deep, and so you rely heavily on what other people tell you is the truth. It's very, very. The other side of that coin, Stefanie, is that so there are some facts that seem to be impossible to have actually influenced policy. And I'll give you one. It is the law in most non-right-to-life states, including, I believe, Connecticut, but certainly in New Jersey, that you must, in the case of a reduction in force, you must fire a teacher who 1,000 out of 1,000 deans of education, school popes and bishops agreed was the best teacher in the district, and retain the job of a teacher who the same 1,000 people agreed was considerably less effective if that latter was one day more senior. That is a statute in the state of New Jersey. You cannot, that's a fact. You cannot defend that on the basis of either policy and yet that is an immutable reality in our state, and I would say, it certainly is New York, and I don't know about Connecticut, but it may well be. So that is a die on the field of battle issue for the union, touching seniority in that respect. That is, this cannot happen, right? We cannot continue to be elected as union officials if that happens. And I will tell you that there is a subset of issues that are absolutely untouchable on the basis of research or fact, and that's.
Gary, for you?
For me, and I think for the legislature, facts are important and critical. I think kind of what Tim was saying earlier, though, is a lot of what's presented as fact is not fact. And so, it's one of these things where some people will walk away from the discussion saying, we presented the facts to the legislators and they didn't act upon the facts. And they didn't really present the facts. They presented pretty hard opinions. Legislators have a job to do, which partially includes discerning whether or not they're being presented with facts. On the issue of what the unions would do with something like that seniority issue, I think it's right within the purview of the unions to defend that. Right? The job of a legislator, though, is not to necessarily go along with their defense of that. They may ultimately decide they want to go along with it, but I think the interest groups, which include unions, have things that they are interested in, things that are valuable to them, and they should defend them. The legislature, although that may be a core constituency, depending on the legislature, has a job to do, which does not include defending that necessarily. And so I don't see anything wrong with the unions defending it. I think that's what they're there to do. And I think part of what happens in these discussions is we talk about what this group or that group's doing, when the focus should be on what's the legislature doing. And why is the legislature doing what it's doing? And I think that sometimes gets lost. And the legislators, by the way, get off when you focus on what those other groups are doing. And so if we're concerned about facts, the place where we need to be concerned about facts is how does the legislature handle facts? Other people, they don't have a responsibility. I'm not saying they don't, but they don't have a responsibility to handle facts in a certain way.
That's a pretty provocative statement. What do you think, Tim?
I think both of those are right, that it really is the job of anybody that's making decisions to filter different information. But what I think is equally important is that we sometimes claim that we don't know stuff that we actually do know. So people will say something and either assert it as fact and have it be carried, or they will claim that there's just nothing known about that, so it's okay if I make some sweeping, hopeful assertion because it won't be checked. And I'll give you an example. We sometimes talk about how many classrooms currently are led by a teacher who's ineffective. And this can lead to shouting matches and the knife fights, where somebody will say, it's 2%, and somebody else will say, well, I think it's 10%. And it just kind of goes on like that, right? But we have piles and piles of research that look at teacher performance over time, measured by test scores, measured by observations, measured by student surveys, all of this stuff that the Met Project has done. And people really will shout at each other all day instead of going to the bookshelf and pulling something down and sitting down with it. And the answer is actually far more shocking than any of the people I think in some of the conversations would assert. We have a standard we could use to say if somebody's not good, how would we decide that? Well, one way is to say, are they worse than a first-year teacher? So if somebody's been teaching for 7 or more years and they teach like a new person, they're seasoned but not skilled. And we could probably all agree that first-year teachers is not a high bar to meet, and if you get 7 years to meet it, that's a lot of time. And if you use the value-added scores, similar to the way that a lot of researchers do, it's like 40% of teachers are more like a novice. That number shocked us, but it turns out that it's pretty consistent across dozens of studies. So you can not like the number, you can not like the measure, but it really doesn't vary that much across large populations. But what if you use a different measure and you say, we don't care about test scores, what we care about is how kids feel. So we use the surveys, like the Met study did, and we ask about, does your teacher teach you to continue trying hard when things are difficult? Does your teacher increase your love of learning? Things that don't say test score or outcome anywhere. And the number is 41%. 41% of teachers with 7 or more years of experience have worse student survey scores than somebody with 1 year. And if you use observations, it's still in the high 20s. It's not 40, but it's almost 30. So all day long, people will claim that we don't know or that they do know. But let me tell you that no one is going to say 30% or 35% or 40% because that's a problem that's actually too big for us to deal with, either by figuring out how to improve those people or figuring out how those people cannot be there anymore. It's actually much easier to rationalize it and make it a number that we can deal with. And the numbers that I just quoted to you, if we had a panel of 100 researchers up here, I think like 96 of them would concede all 3 of those points. They may not all agree on the policy implications. But I think that that's one place where research is out there. It is often not persuasive, partly because we run from it instead of putting it forward.
Great. I'd like to go ahead and turn to questions. If you'll all please say your name and your organization before your question.
Certainly. I'm Daniel Woodring, an attorney from Florida. I had the privilege of being counsel for education for Jeb Bush for a number of years. Question for you. Talking about what's fact and what's not, it seems from what we've seen here and a lot of other research that there's pretty much a consensus on the effective teacher and the impact on student outcome. A lot of the things you talked about here, though, today that are barriers to that, as far as the LIFO, last in, first out, the tenure rules, the other things, are because of union contracts, yet in most states, believe Maryland over there, union contracts don't apply to charter schools. We have a significant population there. Is there a reason that this research and everything has not really been, shall we say, piloted in charter schools since they don't have the same barriers? And if there's not a reason, what can we do to bring that about? Because that might give you some success examples before your regular schools get there.
Well, I think these ideas are being piloted in charter schools, where the human capital rules, it very much depends on the state law, but are considerably more relaxed. I mean, there is something called streamlined tenure in New Jersey, which is much different and much more accelerated than regular tenure. But in many states, there's no tenure at all. There's an opportunity to engage in collective bargaining, but you're not part of the bargaining unit of the jurisdiction in which your school sits. So I would say that, you know, there's always an interesting debate between the sort of charter folks and the folks who view charters as, you know, competition or worse. Says, well, it's not fair, the latter will say, because you have all these advantages. You don't have the same rules, you don't have the same regulations, you don't have the same. And the answer is, well, that's probably true, but what are the policy implications of that? Maybe we should have fewer rules and regulations and the like in the non-charter context.
Okay, anyone, either of you other want to respond? Okay, next, thank you. Next question.
My name is Representative Dan McKay. I'm starting my second term as a legislator here in Utah. We've had a spotty effectiveness with implementing school reform. It always in our state turns on the legislature versus the teachers union. And in several respects, maybe our state is unique, and I'm sure nobody else in this room has ever dealt with that. And by the way, in our state, I think they offer the same level of credibility publicly. So one thing we struggle with is in these reform issues is how do we make reform and separate teachers and tell the story that you're trying to do what's right for students and at the same time fend off the outside union support on some of these issues. Really this is a strategy implementation or a strategy question for you as we look at a few major reforms coming up in this upcoming interim session, around property taxes and all these other things. We're just anticipating this argument and know there's got to be a better way than what we're currently doing.
So, I don't know your state, so I guess I'll speak generally, but part of what I've seen, at least in my state, is those who want to do education reform want to do it and generally will do it by introducing some piece of legislation. It's a pretty bad way to go about it. I think the conversations need to happen way before that legislation ever shows up. Again, to Tim's point and to the point I made earlier, some of the stuff that we intend to do in many of the states is stuff that the unions would actually agree with. But I think sometimes when you intend to do something and you don't bring me into the conversation, it's part of what I do to push back against you. So, I think investigating, finding out what the unions are willing to do. I mean, if you go to AFT's website, for instance, you go through their documents, some of the stuff that we want to do in some of these states, they have it written. I mean, there's no argument there. I mean, maybe they don't want to do it exactly like we want to do it, but they have it written in their documents, right? And so you can't come off the position that you have on paper, right? Now, not everybody knows you have that position. That's one thing. But you can't come off the position you already have down on paper, right? I show you, look, this is the paper. AFT says we want to do this. But we don't do that. We just start off and go, look, this is what we want to do. And then they go, oh, you're changing. We don't want to talk about this. And it becomes a fight. And so I think that's the approach I would take. That's the approach I've always taken. I've sat down with the unions, and it doesn't mean they go along with me. Look, knife fights, I've been in a lot of them. I have a lot of Band-Aids, right? But that's how you begin the conversation. And I think generally it works better. And then I think, look, this is the reality. I think you have to have some legislators who are willing to have that fight and perhaps lose the fight. Because I think what happens is legislators who, when they see there's a potential for losing that fight and there might be repercussions for it, don't want to continue having that fight.
So if I could just add, so I will tell you that, in two recent experiences that when we actually got down to the discussion, we had a very collegial, collaborative conversation. People had points of view. When we negotiated the tenure bill with the NJEA, once we went through, a process, which Gary is, I'm sure, intimately familiar with, we actually got into sort of solutions mode and problem-solving mode and found a lot of common ground. And when we identified areas where they just couldn't go anywhere, we dealt with it, both compromise and concession. And we just announced last week that we negotiated with the actual senior leadership of the AFT a new contract in Newark that has, almost a reformer's wish list in it in terms of a lot of things like the compensation system and the like. And so, for all the, the back and forth up here, a lot of which, I suppose is attributable to me, there are definitely leaders in unions who they're managing their own politics, they're managing their own left flank, some of which are really out there, but they're also trying to, preserve the organization as times change, and they can be worked with. And then, lastly, I would tell you that no one yet, to my knowledge, has really won one of these without winning the public battle out there. Meaning, if you look at what happened in Illinois, if you look at some things that have happened in California, a little bit of what happened in our state, that to get a big bill passed, there needs to be an incredibly heavy investment in communications, in advertising, if it takes that, in just engaging stakeholders around, what the policy issues are and what the facts are. It's very frustrating because it doesn't always work, but it's an essential part of the process.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Levi Patrick. I'm from the Oklahoma State Department of Education. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts. I came thinking about developing and retaining teachers. And I know a lot of that conversation usually goes to teacher effectiveness. And on the flip side, we have a lot of conversations. We here if we had time to say we want teachers to make more money. But a mentor of mine had done just a very informal study in her district, and she basically asked the teachers, if you made a third more of your salary, would you work the other 3 months of the year? And overwhelmingly, the teachers said no. 2 years ago, I taught in one of the lowest performing schools in the state of Oklahoma. I was a department chair for a staff of 19 math teachers, 16 of which were brand new to the school. We were in a place, right? They said, we want to incentivize this. So they gave us 11% more money so that we'd work 11% more time. And I did not work 11% harder. I wasn't an 11% better teacher. It was money that was given to me, and I went there and I did my best, and had they not given me the money, I would have still have done my best. And so both of those, I think, fall into the same thing. When we think about developing and retaining, we talk about maybe some things that are more about how do we get bad teachers out, and we talk about money, which I actually don't think really is a solution that we're dealing with here. And my question maybe is mainly for Tim here, is what do we do now? What is the policy that we put into place that gives teachers a reason to stay, a reason to do good things?
Those are all good points. So I'm going to try and amplify two of them. The first one is around hours that teachers work. One of the most shocking things that our analysts found when we did this study around irreplaceables, and this was tens of thousands of teachers, was that the very best and the very worst teachers worked exactly the same number of hours per week, down to the 10th of an hour. So that meant a couple of things. One thing was all teachers generally worked a lot. Even bad teachers were working a lot of hours in school and out of school. And that means that the solution would not be telling them to work harder. So the lazy teacher thing, it seems to have no place in fact. But it also means that these teachers are bad even though they're working a lot of hours. And in some ways that's discouraging because it probably means that this is all they can give us. And it meant that we had to be careful. Don't be angry at them because they're not good. This is much more of a skill thing than it is heart. It's not that they're not giving us what they've got. It's that they don't know how to make it happen, and that's sort of a different thing. On money, there's another important thing, which is that whenever they survey teachers who are in the profession that have chosen a particular structure of the deal, meaning it's this many days of work a year, it's this is kind of the structure of how the calendar works, you get done at 3 o'clock every day. Most of them don't want that many changes to the way the deal is structured, but that's because these are the people who opted in, and they have gone through many, many, many gates where they could have chosen to do something else instead of this, and yet they chose to stick with this. The people who don't get surveyed are the over 50% of people who aren't there in year 5 anymore, and it turns out they have a totally different story. So for that group of people, making more money faster is extremely important, and it's the number one reason in many cases why they're gone, because they're seeking a raise. So for instance, they move up to become principals, or they decide to change from a classroom teacher to become some kind of a specialist where they're no longer in the classroom. So for us, the way to think about money is not, can I get the exact same people to teach harder or better or to reach for something that they wouldn't normally reach for? I think that the biggest power of money is to get people to do exactly what they're doing now for a longer period of time. Retention is the most powerful thing. So if we currently are getting 4 years on average from our great teachers, we actually can use money to convince them not to leave us as quickly. We can get 8 years out of them. I don't think we should hold it in front of them to, as micro little incentives, like if you work office hours every week, we're going to give you $8.50 more. That's often the way we thought about it before. But I will say this, there is overwhelming evidence that if we change the arc and the trajectory of the teaching profession, so people who are very good at it are in a different tax bracket, can buy a different house, drive a different car, and have visibility and compensation that is currently not available, it will utterly change the people who consider teaching. And right now in the United States, a huge number of our young people who we need them to want this and to try this, wouldn't dream of it because there's no upside, right? There's no way to win the way they would like to win.
So it's really the wage compression.
It's the wage compression, and it's also this combination, I think, of status that goes in it. I mean, one of the biggest things about teaching is that it's perceived that lower qualified people elsewhere are considering it. So it's a little bit of who is your peer group. Mm-hmm. And I think that the essential pillars of the profession have not served us well. So it's not just rethinking compensation, but some of these other things.
Can I jump in real quick? I think that's very important. I also think that Tim, you talked earlier about the environment in which people are teaching and how important that is. I think in terms of legislation, we don't really deal well with that. So we'll talk about turning around the school, right? Like if the school fails, we'll talk about turning around the school. But we'll have people who are in schools where the students who come to the schools come from compressed communities, where there's actual violence, there's noise violence, there's trauma. Many of the students who go to the schools in the city of New Haven, they walk around with these buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on their coats. They have trauma. They have multiple instances of trauma. They can't function in the school. You can have a good teacher there who will probably make it better for them, but they can't function. And when we talk about legislation, we spend a lot of money on once the school's failed, but we don't do much in terms of what's foundational. We don't do much in terms of dealing with that trauma, dealing with the gap in words that kids have. All of the things we know are factors in the school. We do a pretty poor job nationwide. And I think we need to do a better job of that, because if I'm a teacher, and money is important to all of us, but it's also important where I'm working and what I'm going to be able to do with those skills that I have. And when we talked about this education reform bill, the one thing that and actually there was an article that came out the day after where I talked about this is great, but it's only a small step. And people are like shocked, like you had this huge bill. Why are you talking about this small step? Because we're talking about what happens after we failed. And that's what most of the discussion is talking about, turning around the school, changing, all of that's wonderful. But what happens to the kid who's poor or a person of color who comes with this many words and this other kid who comes with a room full of words, right? How do you close that gap? Nobody's talking about that. And I think we need to start focusing on that because it makes it easier for those teachers who go into those neighborhoods to be able to do their job. And so that's a fault of legislators, and we have to do a better job there.
Can I just make one point about the compensation very quickly to the response to the question from the gentleman from Oklahoma? I actually think there was a very deep truth buried in what you just said. I don't think that we should be, operating on the assumption that if you give a large financial award, and in the form of a bonus to someone, that they're going to change their behavior. And I think actually Tim offered some research in support of that. But what I do think is intuitive and right is that we ought to be allowed to engage in differential pay to individuals, regardless of what that means. If it costs more to get a science teacher, you should be free to do that. If you just want to send a message of recognition, not because it'll make someone behave better next year, but to say, we value the learning that you have caused your children to achieve, that's a symbolic statement in the form of a bonus. It's not like that means you're going to work harder next year. Or, anyone who run a company, right? All of a sudden, someone knocks on the door, they're looking at their shoes, you say, oh no, here we go. And the guy says, well, I got another job, I'm leaving, right? You want to be able to say, what's it going to take to keep you? Well, what's it going to take? What can I do for you? We've all had that. Many people in this room have had that discussion. You can't have that discussion in public education because of the mandated nature of lockstep pay, where everybody is treated in this non-differential way. And that kind of, lastly I'll say that I could not agree more with Tim, that if you gave young people an opportunity to move to a higher step earlier in life and to have their pensions be some kind of portable 401k or something with the way it is for much of the world, I think you would see a very different kind of set of choices that young people made. Now there's every incentive in the world to move up the step and then to lock in your pension, even when you've realized, as in the case of a material number of people, that, this isn't for me, I'm burned out, I'm not ready, this is not right for me. Now you're massively incented to ride it out to the end. And that's a deep problem.
So last two questions. Giselle?
I'm Giselle Huff with the Jacqueline Newman Foundation. This is a question for Gary. I really appreciated the way you presented the sausage making at the beginning of your comments. And what I was wondering about is where does logic fit into this? Because, when you forget about research. I mean, research is important, but there is a logic which would dictate that if the legislators in Connecticut are aware of this horrendous achievement gap that exists, that when the discussions begin, solutions have to be put on the table that address that and cannot, sidestep it. And just as an example, one of the last in, first out kind of thing is obvious. I mean, it's as logical as the day is long. If the best person is booted out because they're one day less senior than the worst person or a person who's not doing as well, that can't be helping the children. So I'm just wondering how logic, and I understand, you know, the sausage making, but where does the moment in time come where people say this is about the kids and this is not tenable? I mean, it's indefensible.
That's a great question. I'm not even sure I know how to answer that question. Look, let me step back for a second. And I've said this, and I think it rankles some people, but I don't think that the discussion, at least in my state, and I won't talk about any other state, and in my state is really about the kids at all. I think the reason that we're talking about education reform the way we're talking about it in Connecticut is because we've been embarrassed nationally. We were fine with having a big achievement gap in the state of Connecticut, partially because of the makeup of the legislature. Most of the people in the legislature don't have those people who are, or at least don't think they have those people who are at the wrong end of the achievement gap as their constituents. Now, that means that they don't recognize that even the people at the very top in Connecticut aren't where they need to be, but that's not a conversation we have. We talk about the poor people and the people of color. And look, if you're in the state of Connecticut, look at the state of Connecticut. So you have pockets where you have those people. And so it's very easy not to deal with that. So if you want to talk about logic, like this, what you're talking about is not just logic, it's about emotion. Do you connect to people who you don't connect to in a physical space, who you don't see all the time? That's part of it, right? And the reason we're talking about this really, if you really want to be honest about it, is because of economics. Because in the state of Connecticut, with the changing demographics in that state, you need the people who are black and brown in that state and who are poor to be doing a hell of a lot better than they're doing, because you can't do science, technology, engineering, mathematics, biology, all of those things if you don't have an education. That's the only reason why we're really talking about it in the way that we're talking about it. And I know people don't like to hear it, but it's not about logic, it's not about emotional connection, it's about economics. That's the end of the day. And so when they see an economic incentive that pushes them to do last in, first out and change the policy, it will change. If they don't see an economic incentive, it won't change. When they see an economic incentive to do Senate Bill 24, which became Senate Bill 458 that we did last year, it will change. If they don't see it, it won't change. And that's my personal opinion. So I don't know exactly how to address your thing, but that's what I see as the truth of the situation.
Thank you. Okay, last question.
Thank you. My name is Yovel. I'm from No Child Held Back. I hope that this won't be perceived as too much of a provocative question, but I have a two-piece question. One is, in the conversation about teacher effectiveness, it sounds like most of the focus is teacher measurements and looking at who is and who isn't effective. I would like, Tim, if you could kind of elaborate on what is being done to actually give teachers tools to be more effective. What are best practices, or things that are not just to measure who is performing or not, but really who, like supporting them in becoming more effective, assuming they want to be effective. The other part of the question is, if we're looking into the future, do you think 5 years into the future, or whatever the date in your mind is, I think it's going to happen a lot faster, does teacher effectiveness mean different things in 5 years or 8 years, when we won't be relying on just a piece of chalk and a blackboard, even if it's a smart board? Teacher effectiveness in that future, are we prepared for that? Are we, if at all, getting ready for that?
I'll have to be quick, so I'm going to answer your second question first. It will definitely change. I think for a lot of teachers, it's going to be similar to what it is now, but no, we're not prepared for all the ways that it's going to change. I think it's going to require a lot of adjustment on the fly. To the question of helping teachers get better, on one level, I agree with you that we have to think about that, and currently, there's not enough known about how to help teachers get better. On the other hand, what is known is that that's where all the money's going. So billions and billions of dollars are spent, and yet most of the improvement to a teacher is currently natural, meaning we can predict it just based on the fact that now they're a second-year teacher and now a third-year teacher. It's a natural return to experience. That is almost all of it. We don't have ways of saying if we do this and provide these experiences, we're going to get a very different outcome. And that should be scary to us, because it's not like people haven't been trying. For decades they've been trying. But for the most part, you can know based on a teacher's first 2 years what their career arc is going to be. We have to break that cycle.
So, the gentleman, there you are in the back. So I actually think it's important to say, because we talk, very tough about, whether the number is 1%, 2%, 10%, or the numbers that Tim was putting out there. I think another sort of truism here is that we would do more for kids, particularly kids in need, by turning our average teachers into good ones, or our good ones into great ones, or even our sub-average teachers into okay teachers, than we would by, quote, exiting the bottom X%. Now, Tim and others may disagree with that.
That's right. That's correct.
But so in other words, while we do focus in conversation like this very heavily on, that bottom echelon, whatever number gets assigned to that, there's no question that we can't give up on the mission of increasing, giving people a chance to be success through different tools, different training, different education opportunities, and so on. So I just didn't want that point to be lost in, what sometimes is, as I said, a hard-edged conversation. The other thing I would say is what's going to be different in the future. If I were to do sort of a step back and look at history, I think one of the things that happened here is that our teacher effectiveness work got ahead of the quality of our assessments, and that we launched into this when our assessment instruments were really pretty primitive and lots of, could be beat by drill and kill and so on. So I think that we will see a higher level of confidence in measuring outcomes and evaluating people, at least on multiple measures, but in part on the basis of outcomes, as we develop a higher level of confidence in the new set of assessments, which, fingers crossed, are headed our way within the next couple of years.
No, I think that's an interesting note to end on. The question of professional development, when we survey teachers, we hear that, one, what do they need more of? They need professional development and ways to help improve. And two, they think that what they have is crap. So we're spending billions of dollars on stuff that teachers say they need, but it's, that they don't need. So the measurement discussion is part of a system that is designed, one, to set a common standard, two, to have some measurement, three, to have some diagnostic and some feedback, so you actually know what you're improving towards. So I do think, to Chris's point, that sometimes we talk so much about the measurement because we haven't done that, and that's a necessary precursor to actually having these other components be more effective. So we are at time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
How long have you been in